The full history of the United States of America. There is a nation that was never meant to exist. It began as a scattering of colonies clinging to the edge of a vast and unmapped continent, dependent on a distant king, divided by geography, religion, and purpose. Within 2 centuries, it would command the largest economy on Earth, station its soldiers on every continent, and shape the daily lives of billions of people who would never set foot within its borders. This is the story of how that happened, and it is also the story of the fragile machinery beneath it all. The quiet truth that no power, however vast, escapes the same forces that consumed every empire before it. In the beginning, there was no order. The land that would become the United States was not empty. It held hundreds of nations, thousands of languages, and civilizations older than the cathedrals of Europe. But by the 17th century, disease had already done its work. Waves of smallpox and influenza, carried ahead of the settlers themselves, swept through the interior and hollowed out the population. Villages emptied. Fields returned to forest. Some historians estimate that 90% of the native population vanished before most Europeans ever arrived to see them. Into that silence came the settlers. They came in small numbers at first, hungry and unprepared. They came for God, for gold, for land, for escape. They planted colonies along the Atlantic coast and buried most of their first generation in the frozen ground. But they held on, and slowly, across 100 years, 13 colonies took shape, each one different, each one governed loosely from London, each one growing wealthy on tobacco, timber, and the forced labor of enslaved men and women brought in chains across the ocean. For a time, the arrangement worked. The colonies obeyed. The crown collected. Distance kept the peace. But this would not last. The problem was simple and, in hindsight, inevitable. The colonists had grown into something the crown had not intended. They governed their own towns. They printed their own newspapers. They came to believe that the rights of Englishmen belonged to them 3,000 miles from England. When the king raised taxes to pay for his wars, the colonists did not see a bill. They saw a master reaching across the sea. The break came slowly, then all at once. In 1776, 56 men in Philadelphia signed a document declaring that a new nation had the right to exist. It was, at the time, an act of treason with almost no chance of success. They faced the most powerful military on Earth with a ragged army, no navy, and no money. The war that followed lasted 8 years. It was won not by strength, but by endurance, by geography, and by the intervention of France, who joined the war for reasons of its own. When it ended, something unprecedented stood on the map. A republic, no king, no emperor. Power drawn from the consent of the governed. Though at first the governed meant only white men who owned property, the rest waited in the margins of the promise. The new nation was weak, indebted, and unsure it would survive its first decade. Its states quarreled like rival countries. Its government could barely collect a tax. But in 1787, a small group of men wrote a constitution designed to hold the fragile thing together, a system of balanced powers meant to prevent any one man or any one faction from seizing everything. It was an experiment. Few expected it to last, yet it held, and as it held, it began to grow. The growth was staggering. In 1803, the young nation bought a vast stretch of land from France for a sum that seems almost trivial in memory, and doubled its size overnight. Then it kept moving. West across the rivers, west across the plains, west toward an ocean it had never seen. The settlers called this destiny. They spoke of it as though the continent had been waiting for them, as though the mountains and rivers had been arranged for their arrival. The people already living there were told to move, or die, or disappear. Treaties were signed and broken within a generation. Entire nations were marched at gunpoint from their homelands, and thousands died along the roads. The expansion that made America vast was built mile by mile on the removal of those who came first. And beneath the expansion lay a deeper contradiction, one written into the nation's founding and never resolved. A country that declared all men equal held millions in bondage. The North grew on factories and free labor. The South grew on cotton and slavery. For decades, the two halves stitched together compromise after compromise. each one buying a little more time, each one leaving the wound open. The politicians called it balance. It was only delay. However, the delay was running out. In 1861, the nation broke in two. The war that followed was the deadliest in American history, deadlier than every other American war combined. More than 600,000 men died in 4 years. Whole towns lost their sons. The rivers ran with the dead, and the fields of the South were burned to ash. At the center of it stood a lawyer from the frontier, elected president just before the collapse, Abraham Lincoln. He had not begun the war to end slavery. He had begun it to hold the nation together. But by its end, he understood that the two could no longer be separated. In 1863, he declared the enslaved of the rebel states free. 2 years later, the Union won, the Confederacy fell, and slavery was abolished by law. Lincoln did not live to see the peace. He was killed 5 days after the war ended, shot in a theater by a man who believed he was saving the South. The nation survived, but it was changed and it was not healed. The promise of freedom given to 4 million people was betrayed within a generation. New laws rose to replace the old chains. Segregation hardened into a system. The wound closed on the surface and festered underneath, and it would take another 100 years before the country returned to face it. Yet even as it fractured within, the nation was becoming something the world had never seen. The decades after the war belonged to the machine. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel mills lit the night sky. Oil, coal, and electricity remade the rhythm of human life. Cities swelled with immigrants from every corner of Europe, pouring through the harbors by the millions, chasing a promise printed on the base of a statue in New York. The scale was without precedent. By the beginning of the 20th century, the United States produced more steel than Britain and Germany combined. It had grown from a farming republic into the most powerful industrial economy on the planet, and it had done so in a single lifetime. But the wealth was not shared. A handful of men controlled fortunes larger than entire states. Workers labored 12 hours a day in dangerous factories for wages that barely kept them alive. Children worked in the mines. The gap between the top and the bottom grew into a chasm. For a while, the country looked away. The growth was too fast, too intoxicating to question. However, the stability was an illusion. The 20th century arrived, and with it, the world came knocking. Twice war engulfed Europe. Twice America tried to stay out, and twice it was pulled in reluctantly the first time, decisively the second. In 1941, an attack on a naval base in the Pacific ended the debate. The nation mobilized on a scale never seen before. Factories that built cars began building tanks and bombers by the tens of thousands. An entire economy turned toward destruction. When the Second World War ended in 1945, most of the industrial world lay in ruins. Europe was shattered, Asia was burning, and the United States, untouched on its own soil, stood alone at the summit, holding half the world's wealth and a weapon no one else possessed. It had ended the war by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan, killing well over 100,000 people in seconds. In that light, a new age began. And in that age, only 2 powers remained standing. The peace, such as it was, did not last long. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union circled each other. They never fought directly. They did not dare. Instead, they fought through proxies, through spies, through client states in distant wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in a dozen places whose names most Americans could not find on a map. They built enough nuclear weapons to end the human species many times over, and then they built more. At home, the contradictions returned to the surface.
It is present.
The descendants of the enslaved, still denied equality a century after emancipation, rose to demand the freedom they had been promised. They marched. They were beaten, jailed, and killed. But they did not stop. And slowly the laws changed, even as the deeper inequalities remained. The nation reached for the impossible and touched it. In 1969, it put men on the moon, a feat so vast it seemed to belong to mythology rather than history. It broadcast the image to the world, proof of what a nation could do when it turned its full power toward a single goal. Then, in 1991, the great rival collapsed. The Soviet Union dissolved almost without a shot, And for the first time in history, one nation stood without equal economically, militarily, culturally over the entire globe. It seemed to many like the end of the story. A final victory, a permanent order. But history does not end, it only pauses. The decades that followed brought new wars, fought against enemies without borders. They brought a financial system so vast and so tangled that when it broke in 2008, it shook every economy on Earth. They brought technologies that connected billions of minds and in the same motion, divided them. The nation that had once been bound by common purpose grew fractured by suspicion, by grievance, by a widening gap between those who held the wealth and those who did not. The pattern by now was familiar. It was the same pattern that had consumed Rome and Britain and every power that ever believed itself eternal. Expansion, confidence, division. The slow return of the contradictions that were never truly resolved, only postponed. The United States remains at this moment the most powerful nation in the world. Its economy is the largest ever built. Its military reaches every ocean. Its culture flows into homes on every continent, shaping how the world speaks, dreams, and imagines itself. And yet the story of every great power is the same. They rise faster than they understand. They forget that they were built on contradictions, and they mistake a moment of dominance for a law of nature. The United States was never meant to exist. For 2.5 centuries, it has defied that fact again and again through war and division and reinvention. Whether it defies it once more or joins the long procession of empires that believed they were the exception, remains unwritten. History is patient. It has watched this before, and it is watching still.